In this part of Become an App Developer, you will learn the very basics of styling HTML markup with CSS. CSS stands for Cascade Style Sheet and is used for positioning and styling HTML elements. We will not cover everything you need to know in CSS, but rather give you a basic knowledge of how to style elements and how to create simple, responsive user interfaces. We will start by taking a look at how to reference a CSS style to an HTML tag. Then you will learn the difference between CSS classes and IDs. And after that, you will learn how to style text with CSS. Then we'll proceed to styling div tags. And finally, we will create a layout with flex, similar to the layout you see right here. Flex is commonly used in React Native to create responsive user interfaces. And as you can see in this example layout, if I drag the browser, make it bigger or smaller, the layout automatically resizes to fit the browser size. So let's get started with some basic CSS. And now if you already have CSS experience, you can go ahead and skip this part of the tutorial. But if you're a beginner, you should really follow along this part. So now the first thing we're going to do, we're going to start off with a blank HTML document as you learned to create in the previous HTML tutorial. Then we're going to add a style sheet, a link to a style sheet. So just type link and then hit tab. And this will create a link to a style sheet for us. We will create this style sheet in just a second. Now in the href attribute, we're going to specify what the name of our style sheet is going to be. We can call it styles.css, like that. Now go up to your folder in Sublime Text and create new file. Save the file as styles.css, like that. Now this file will contain all the styles that we're gonna need for a web page. So let's start by just learning how to reference a CSS style to an HTML tag. So as you learned in the previous HTML tutorial, we can create simple div tags like this. So go ahead and create a simple div tag like that, and then we can add some content in it. Just type IAmContainer. And as you can see now, we get the div class right here. Or sorry, the div right there with some content in it. Now what you want to do is you want to add an attribute called class. So go ahead and type class equals to, and here we're going to specify the class name that we want to assign to this div. Now I'm going to call this container, like that. And now to reference this class and be able to style it, we're going to open up our styles.css file. And a CSS class always starts with a dot. So type a dot followed by the class name we want to reference. And now we set the class name to container. And then open brackets and close brackets. And now let's add some basic CSS styling to this container, just to check so everything works okay. And go ahead and add a background color. Let's set it to, we can type just gray like that. And as you can see now, this div has a background color of gray. So we're actually referencing this div by its class name, which is container, and creating the styles for the container in the style sheet. Now we also need to take a look at using IDs. This is called a class, and also there's something called IDs or an ID. Now to reference a div with an ID, we're going to create a new div like that. We can add some text in it. Let's say I am container2. And we're going to add an attribute this time. Instead of class, we're going to add ID equals to, and we can call this container2. So you can see we got the container2 below container1 in its own div. But we have no styles for it yet. So now we're going to do exactly the same as we did right here when we reference the container. But this time it's going to be referenced by an ID instead. Now an ID is referenced by a hashtag or a hash mark, like that. Not a hashtag, sorry. It's supposed to be it's just called a hash. Anyway, like that, and then you define the name for it like that. And we call it container2, and then opening bracket and closing bracket. Now let's add some background color for this one too. We can just give it red. So now we got two divs, one with a class name and one with an ID. And you style them exactly the same. The only difference is how you reference them. So for classes you use dots, and for IDs you use the hash. Now you're probably wondering, when should I use a class and when should I use an ID? The answer to that is really simple. You will use a class attribute when you have an element that is used multiple times in your application. So this container div, we might have 3 container divs like this. And then you should use the class name. When you use the ID is when you only have one element with one unique name. And no other element on this page has the ID container2. So we're gonna use this. We'll keep this to an ID. And let's use these that are sharing the same name. We're gonna use a class for them instead. Another difference between an ID and a class is that an ID only have one ID. Like that. A class can actually have multiple classes. Like that. You can just add how many classes you want after the initial class. So let's say we will give this container a class of extra class. Oops. Extra class. And then go into the style of CSS and define the class called extra class. And let's give it some padding. Let's give it 20 pixels. Now you will see one of these becoming really big. And that's the first one which we gave the extra class, on which we defined some padding. Now the padding will take up space from the div's edges to the content. That's all the padding does. So that's how to reference a CSS style to an HTML tag, and also the difference between IDs and classes. So now let's take a look at how to style text with HTML and CSS. You can go ahead and delete these divs that we just created. Keep the style sheet here and open up the styles.css file, and you can delete all the code inside it. Open up index.html and create a p tag for paragraph and give it a class. We can call this just text, like that. Now open up styles.css and we're gonna reference the text class we just created with dot and then followed by text, opening brackets, closing brackets. Let's open up index.html and just add some text inside here. We can say I am a paragraph. So you can see we got some text over in the browser. So now we're just gonna take a look at like some really basic styles for a text inside an HTML document. This will come in handy later in React Native. We can start by just using the style property font size, which will change the size of the font. Let's set it to 24 pixels. So you can see the font got a little bit bigger. Let's also change the font family from Times New Roman, which is the default font family. We can change this to Verdana. So you can see we got a different font family on this paragraph tag right now. You can also use something called font weight. If you set it to lighter, the text will become lighter. If you set it to normal, it will be normal as it was previously. If you set it to bold, it will become bolder. So let's use bold. You can also change the color of the text by just specifying color, and then let's say gray, like that. You can also use something called text decoration, where we can add an underline to the text. So as you can see, we get an underline right now. Now let's say this text is aligned left within the p tag right now, but what if we wanted to have maybe the text in the center? Then we can use something called text align and set it to center. We can also use something called text transform. Let's set it to uppercase. Now this will actually transform all the lowercase letters to uppercase letters, just like that. You can also change the line height. Let's set it to 28 pixels. Now you won't see any difference now, but if we had multiple lines of text below each other, the bigger the line height, the bigger the margin between the lines would be. So it would increase the margin between the lines of the text. And that's just basically a couple of things you need to know to be able to style CSS. It's not much at all, but just some basic stuff that's good to know to make it look a little bit better and position it as you wish. Now the next thing we're going to take a look at styling is a simple div tag. So open up index.html and let's create a simple div like that. You can add some content in it. Let's say, oh, by the way, let's keep it like that. We don't need no content in that. Instead, add a class attribute, and we can name this container. So as you can see, there's nothing here because this is just a div markup without any content in it. So what we're gonna do now, we're gonna add a new class, so dot and slash container, opening brackets, closing brackets, and let's start by just declaring some basic styles. We can set a width of the container div to 100 and also a height to 100. As you can see, the div is not visible yet because we have nothing defining the div like a background color or anything like that. So let's go ahead and add a background color to this div. We can see, let's give it a gray background. Let's also, you can play along with these values however you want. So, let's set the width. Let's change it from from pixels to percent. Now as you can see, this div will take up the entire browser width because it says 200%. Now you can also see this margin added here, which we don't want. Now this is actually caused by the body's initial margin. So what we can do to make things a little more easy to work with and give our own margins to everything is add a star, which means all tags. So the styles we type here will affect all tags. And set the margin to, we can set it to 0 pixels. And now you'll see everything will collapse because we removed the HTML document's initial margin. So instead now we can add our own margin. So let's take the text and add, let's add some margin to the text. So as you can see now it got margin top, margin bottom. It also got margin to the left and to the right. For the container we don't need any margins, so let's just use it as it is. Now we can also take a look at using positions. We can take a look at the most common, which is relative positions and absolute positions. So let's create a style for the container div. Let's set the position and type relative. Then go to index.html and create a new div. Give it a class. We can name it container inner. Close it up. Then go open up style.css and create the CSS selector for container inner. So dot container inner, opening brackets, closing brackets. Now we can give this an height of, let's say, 50 pixels. Let's give it a width of 50 pixels and also a background color of blue. So as you can see now, the container inner div is simply placed inside our container. And by default, it will just be placed to the left as it is right now. But let's say maybe we want to move this to anywhere, exactly where we specify. Let's say we want to move it to the bottom right. To do this, we can use position absolute and position relative. Now the container has position relative, and in the container inner, we're gonna add position absolute. This means that the container inner would have an absolute position that's relative to its parent. So if I say bottom on the inner container, which is the blue div, I set it to 0. As you can see, it jumps to the bottom. Now also let's set right 0, and it gets to the absolute right. This way we can actually position it exactly where we want with some simple CSS. Let's see if there's anything more maybe we should cover with the div tags. This is just really basic, but it gets you an understanding of how to position div tags and just how to give it some basic background colors. One more thing that I can teach you about HTML layout is you can go ahead and open up, right click, if you're on Chrome, right click the web page, then click on inspect. This will open up the developer console, and here you can actually see the layout you just created. So you can click on body right there, and you can see the text here which we created. You can also see the container. You can open it up and you can see the container inner. Now here to the right you can see the CSS we just created, and this is exactly how we created it. So if we look at the container inner CSS right here, you can see it has position absolute, bottom right, height, width, background color, exactly as we've written it here. And you can actually play along with this directly from the developer console if you want to check how things work before you actually code anything. So you can uncheck things or change things. So you see, if I uncheck position absolute, it will just go back to its original position. So yeah, that's just a quick tip of how you can try things out directly in the browser, and how you can actually delete elements here too, and do a little bit what you want. That's it for creating some basic styles for div tags and for text. So now, as you're getting somewhat familiar to working with some HTML and CSS, we're gonna take a look at creating our very first, very simple user interface. For this, we're gonna use Flex, also known as Flexbox in CSS. And Flex is also what we will use in React Native to create responsive applications. Now, the only difference between working with Flex in a browser and in a React Native app is that in a browser you need to specify every element you want to use as a Flex element as Flex. In React Native, every element is actually already defined as Flex, so you don't have to specify every element with Flex. So it's actually going to be a little bit easier in React Native than it's going to be in the browser. We're just going to create a simple user face with a couple of color boxes. So you can start by deleting the code we just created in the body tag. Also go to styles.css and delete everything but the star at the top. Now open up index.html and we're gonna start by creating as the header. And for creating the header, we're actually not gonna use Flex, we're gonna use percentage instead, just so you get a little bit of understanding how to work with percentage as well. So create the header and give it an ID of header. Open up styles.css. And we're gonna create just a simple header. Let's set the width to 100%. And the height to 160 pixels. We can also give it a background color, yes, so we can see what we're working with. Let's give it 29, maybe 2. This is called hex color scheme. You can check it out online if you want to know more about how to create colors with a hex color scheme. So as you can see, we just got a really simple header. Its width is 100%, which means it's gonna take up the entire browser's width along the x-axis. So it's gonna start over here and end over here. Now what we want to do is create a very first flex container. This flex container is gonna contain 3 flex items that are gonna be stacked along the x-axis and be the exact same size. So go ahead and create a div, give it a class. We can call it class flex container. Close the div off, and inside the flex container we're gonna create a new div, give it a class of, we can call it flex item. We can copy the flex item class and create 2 more, so we got a total of 3 flex items. Now what we want to do is we want to assign a display flex to this div, which will allow its children to use the flex style property. So open up style.css and create the style for flex container, so dot flex container, and we're gonna tell it to be flex box. So set the display to flex and set the flex direction to row. Now adding flex direction to a div determines the primary axis of its layout. Now that maybe sounds fancy. All that means is if we add flex direction row, the children of the flex container are gonna be stacked along the x-axis of its parent. So the items are gonna be aligned horizontally next to each other. So let's go ahead and create the flex item class. Now we're gonna give it a flex of 1. Let's give it a height, and don't worry, I'm gonna explain this in just a second. Let's give it a height of 180 pixels. Let's also add a background color. We can give it a hex color, like that. So now you can see we actually got 3 flex items, exactly the same size, but we can't see them because there's no margin, so everything looks as one. So instead, go ahead under height and add some margin. We can give it 8 pixels margin. And now we can see we got 3 flex items, exactly the same size, taking up the entire space along the x-axis of its parent, which is the flex container. Now, if I wanted this div to be a little bit bigger than these 2, we could actually just change the flex of the first div to 2 and keep these 2 at flex 1. I'm gonna open up the developer console and just show an example of how to do this. So I'm gonna mark this flex item and I'm just gonna give it a flex of 2. And as you can see, now this item is a little bit bigger than these 2. And that's actually how easy it is to work with flex, and it works exactly the same way in React Native. But for now, we're just gonna keep them exactly the same size. Also, let's create a new flex container. But this time, let's just create 2 flex items and see how that works. So we can actually just copy this container. Let's rename it to flex container 2, and we can delete the last flex item. So let's get 2. Let's rename it to flex item 2, like that. And then we can just go ahead and copy the flex container flex item styles. Let's say flex container 2 and flex item 2. And now, as you can see, it works exactly the same. We got 2 flex items, exactly the same size, taking up the x-axis space of the parent, which in this case is flex container 2. Now this flex direction row, as I said, it determines the primary axis of its layout. Now in the browser, if I remove this and reload, you can see nothing changes. That's because in a browser, the default flex direction is row. However, I'm specifying this because in React Native, the default flex direction actually is column, which would make it look like this. They would be stacked below each other instead, along the y-axis. And that's why I'm specifying this in the browser, because you're gonna have to specify this later in React Native if you want the flex direction to be a row along the x-axis. Now one more thing I think we can cover is, by the way, let's change the background color of these two last flex items. We can say 39, B54A, like that. Now let's say maybe we wanted to add a box inside or a div inside this flex item, and we want it to be centered both along the y-axis and the x-axis. How could we do that? Let's open up index.html and go to flex item 2, the first child, and inside it let's create a div, give it a class of box, styles of CSS. And now what we're going to use two properties called align items and justify content. But before that, we're going to have to actually set this flex item 2, so this one, to display as flex. Then we can, let's go ahead and create the styles for the box, and give it we can give it a width of 80 pixels and height of 80 pixels, and yes, set some background color. Let's make it gray, like that. You can see it's just placed where it's supposed to be placed. Now if we want to actually position this box in the center of the y-axis and in the center of the x-axis of this div, we'll use align items on the flex item, so the container of box, and set it to center. This will actually center, as you can see, the box along the y-axis, so vertically. We'll also add something called justify content as well, set it to center, as simple as that, and it will center the box along the x-axis, so horizontally. And that's how we center content. And if I drag the browser now, you can see it's all boxes are resized automatically, and this is what makes it so easy to work with user faces in React Native thanks to Flex, because you create one layout and that layout will work no matter the device, no matter if you're on Android, on iPhone, on tablet, no matter the device width or height or OS, is always gonna look the same and just expand itself to the actual device. So yeah, that's basically how to work with the basics of Flex, and this will come in handy later when we start creating user faces inside the applications.